come sit next to you, so I have to not look all that direction. Are we on? Okay. I believe we're live streaming now, so if you're watching on YouTube, hi, welcome. There's the camera right there, so I'll look at you sometimes, but my audience is over here. I don't know if you can see the audience and over there. So anyway, people are still coming in. I'll be one more moment. I hope you find this interesting. This is going to run until about 12:15 or so. We'll be done at 12:15, and at that point we'll decide what we want to do next, whether we want to call it a wrap, call it quits, or whether we want to gather again after the Country Bazaar so that we can hear more. But next week we are having a potluck after church. So we're not going to be gathering next week. The week after is the bazaar. We're not gathering during the bazaar. So if we do it a second or a third time, it'll be later in October. But I want to welcome you all to this second hour program. This is Mick's fault. Mick showed up in church here back in February or March. And the first day he was here, he cornered me. I'm not quite sure why. But he cornered me and he asked me a question. He said, was the United States founded on Christian principles? And my mouth dropped open as I began to figure out how to answer that question, because it's not an easy question to answer. And somebody jumped in and said, no. And I said, after my jaw finished trying to figure out how to answer, I said, yes, but. And that's what I'm going to be doing today. Yes, but. Because the question is really, really a difficult one. Was the United States founded on Christian principles? There are huge questions, concepts you have to operationalize. What do you mean, United States? What do you mean founded? What do you mean Christian? And what do you mean principles? Did you know that, Mick? Did you realize that it was that complicated? It's so we could spend today until about midnight kind of untangling all of that, but we're not going to. I want to focus on a few pieces. So let me go back to the operationalizing. When you say founded, what do you mean? And there are two places to talk about founding. One is the European arrival. Why did the Europeans come to the New World? Or we're talking about the American War for Independence and the Constitution. Two very, very different periods in our history. They're very different answers depending on where you look. Second, Christian. What's a Christian? Who are Christians? And that's what I'm going to do mostly today, looking at those questions of who Christians are. And then finally, we have the word principles. What are Christian principles? I'll touch some of that today before we're all done. And by the time we're done today, I'm hoping you'll be confused. I mean, now I know you'll be confused, but I'm hoping that you'll have a sense that the story is complex. And there are no simple, quick answers to that question. So let me start in the year 1492. I think only one person expected that because I told him in advance why that would happen. 1492, what happens? Columbus sails the ocean blue. And the reason I start there is because in 1492, Western Europe is all following one religion, with a small exception among the Jewish people who are scattered here and there. But the religion is the Church of Rome. The religion is the Pope's Christianity. It's not called Catholic because there's only one. It's called Christian. Okay? So we start with a unified Spain, Portugal, England, France, Sweden, Netherlands, Germany, which doesn't exist yet, and on and on and on and on and on, right? It's one faith. 1492. By the way, Columbus never gets to the United States. I'm not sure that you know that. He landed a little bit here and there on the islands of the Caribbean. He might have touched the coast of South America once, but I don't remember the details, and I don't care about that personally. But The next date that I want to worry about is 1517. And who aside from, who can tell me what 1517 is all about? Anybody? The Reformation. A guy named Martin Luther, who says, wait a minute, there's a problem here. I won't go into the details, but Martin Luther causes the beginning of a massive fracturing of Western Christianity. And the church becomes the Catholic Church. What has Martin Luther found inadvertently? Lutheranism, which is found where in the world? Germany, Scandinavia, parts of Switzerland, maybe, I'm not sure about that, bits of Poland here and there today. 1524 is the next date that matters. Henry VIII gets tired of not getting boys when his wife gives birth. He thinks God is punishing him for marrying his dead brother's wife. And so he divorces Catherine of Aragon. Actually, he tries to. The Pope says, no, you can't. So he says, Pope, get lost. I'm throwing you out of England. And he starts, not completely, but he starts a new church, the Church of England, which his daughter Elizabeth actually makes herself the head of. Pope is gone, Queen's now in charge of the Church of England. But between Henry VIII and Elizabeth, we have another queen named Mary, who happens to be Catholic, and she brings the place back to being Catholic. So England is now bouncing back and forth, Catholic, Protestant. So that's kind of a mess. That's England. But about the same time, 1540s, 1550s, this guy named John Calvin shows up. John Calvin is a Frenchman who thinks, and let me step back a moment. Martin Luther, let me step back just for a moment. Martin Luther has a major objection to the Catholic Church, or the church. And that objection has to do, in part, there's a bunch more I'll talk about later, but in part to do with how you get into heaven. For the church, for the Catholic Church, the pathway to heaven is through good works. And for Luther, there's something called predestination, where all of us have a ticket. All you need is to take it. Salvation by grace alone. Does that make sense? All of you in the room here, I don't care how good or bad you are, can get to heaven. Just take the ticket. It's right here. Here it is. Take it. That's a huge difference between the Catholic and the Lutheran. Now, John Calvin shows up. He says, no. It's not quite that good. The reality is that some of us, maybe you and you and you and you, and I'm not pointing at any individuals. If I am, I'm sorry. You're going no matter how bad you are, because that's the way it is. I know it's weird, Carol. And you and you and you, I don't care how good, how hard you worked, forget it. It's called double predestination. But before you were formed, God decided where you were going. It's not in your hands. I find that personally very kind of unsettling, but this is not about me. So Calvin shows up and he creates this interpretation which spreads into Scotland with the Presbyterians, spreads into England with the Puritans, spreads into the Netherlands with the Dutch Reform, spreads into other groups here and there, and Christianity starts to really, really fragment. There are other reformers, a guy named Zwingli, he's Swiss, Zwingli. He says, oh, come on. He takes Luther's ideas, and by the way, Henry VIII did only one thing. He got rid of the Pope. The bishops are still there, the incense is still there, all the bells and smells. Thank you, bells and smells. I'm going to say silliness, but bells and smells is a much better description, are still there. Luther is the same way. The Lutheran worship service is as much a Catholic service as anything else. Bishops, bells and smells, all the good stuff. There are a few changes, but there are other people who say, come on, let's get rid of all of these icons, get rid of all of these statues. We need to go focusing very much on simply the cross. Simply focus on our own activity. And these reformers are also called Reform. And they come to the New World also at some point. And anyway, so what I'm telling you is the fragmentation of Christianity, starting in 1517 and ending in about 2012. But I'm going way ahead of myself when I say that. We have German Swiss Reform. We have Baptists emerging. 1609 is when they emerged. Quakers emerged in the 1640s. And during this time, just to get you understanding kind of what's at stake here, during the 1500s, the Spanish Inquisition kicks into high gear.
No one expected it.
Could people hear what you just said, Matt? Probably not. So there was a comment from the back of the room that nobody expected the Spanish Inquisition, exactly. But the Inquisition, the purpose of the Inquisition was to get people back onto the true faith. And the English responded by burning bishops alive. So we're talking about, in fact, the year that Sue and I were in England, I was at Oxford, there's a place on the street where they burned 2 Catholic bishops alive in, I don't remember when, 1540 or thereabouts.
Everyone needs a hobby.
It's not a wonderful, friendly Christianity we're talking about. We're talking about 100 years of warfare, the 80 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, constant struggle between what religion's going to be dominant. And within all of that, we have civil war in England between different kinds of supposedly English Christianities and groups of people here and there. So that's my first piece of what Christian we're talking about, okay? So are you confused yet? Are you boggled yet? Are you kind of going, whoa, our history is kind of more complicated than I thought maybe? So let's make it worse, since Paul is still very much at peace here. Okay, back to Columbus real quick. Remember, Europe is Catholic, Europe is Christian but Catholic. The first European settlement in what's the US happens when? Anybody have any idea? You'll get it wrong, all of you will, I guarantee it. 1585. No. 1585, St. Augustine. Very good, Mary Beth. And where's St. Augustine? It's in Florida. And who did the founding? The Spanish. And what religion did they bring with them? Catholics. The first European presence in the U.S. is a Catholic Spanish presence in Florida, 1585. But you all mentioned 1607 as the one we think about, and that, of course, is Jamestown. And that's in Virginia. And Jamestown, by the way, is king of Scotland, James the Sixth, I think. He's also king of England, James I, because Elizabeth didn't have any kids, and her cousin died, and Anne, and it went off to some random guy who was a second cousin 4 times removed, or something like that. I am exaggerating somewhat when I say that. But James is actually raised Catholic. But he's raised very much aware of the Church of England's traditions that he governs as a Church of England king. He also tries to push back against the radical Protestants who have written what's called the Geneva Bible, which is a viciously anti-Catholic Bible that calls the Pope the Antichrist. And he has given us a book which is called the King James translation of the Bible, which is the Geneva Bible a little toned down. They take out some of the most vicious stuff, but the rest of it, it's still a very certain time period and a certain translation and a certain perspective. And so the English come to Jamestown. And how many of you have seen the movie Pocahontas? It's true. They come looking for gold because the Portuguese and the Spanish are busy pillaging Central South America. They're finding silver, they're finding gold, they're finding really cool stuff, they're getting rich. And England wants that too, so they go to Jamestown to find gold. Is there any gold in Jamestown, Mary Beth? No. So they tried glass blowing. I mean, can you be dumber than making glass in the New World to ship back to England? And so they eventually turn to various crops, and they find tobacco finally. And tobacco becomes the cash crop that makes them able to survive. That's 1607. The next European arrival, any guesses? 1620. Thank you, voice from the great beyond. And what is that voice from the great beyond? No, it's not the Puritans. It's the Pilgrims. There is a huge difference. The Pilgrims are people who believe in the absolute separation of church and state. Nobody else has so far. Sorry? They are Anabaptists. That's not in my top of my memory, but yes, they are Anabaptists. They are pietists, that they believe in quiet personal faith, not in public expressions of faith. And they come to Plymouth Plantation, 1607. They're going to Virginia, but they kind of miss. Oh well. And but they are fleeing, by the way, the Puritans of England, as well as to the Church of England. They actually separate themselves from the Church of England. Nobody else has yet. Church of England is still kind of the English church. The next settlement, guesses anybody? 1626 is the date. New York, very good. No, actually New Amsterdam, because the island of Manhattan is purchased from the natives by the Dutch. Now, Amsterdam is the most amazing city in the Western world at this point. It is the most trade-connected, the most multi-ethnic, the most diverse place in the world in 1626. And they bring it to the New World. And guess what comes with them when they arrive in the New World? Jewish people. And the first synagogue is built on Manhattan in New Amsterdam. It's not there anymore. The oldest synagogue still around is in Rhode Island, but it's there in New Amsterdam. Tolerance of all faiths is like everywhere. Okay? 1630, Boston, the Puritans. Now, they're not very nice people, although I'm from those people. I'll admit that right now. The Puritans have a very severe, very strict understanding of public behavior, of public worship, but they also separate government and church and state. They don't unify them, but they're still very closely connected, but they're not technically unified. 1630. 1634, we got Maryland being founded as a haven for Catholics. That lasts about 10 seconds. And they get kicked out and suppressed, and it becomes Protestant Church of England. But they're still there. And if you go to Maryland, you see the names of places, especially down the eastern shore and down the southern Maryland, south of D.C. and Baltimore. You have Saint this and Saint that because of the Catholic influence. They had to kind of go to the edges of the colony to stay alive. 1636, a guy named Roger Williams. Who knows who he is? Anybody? Rhode Island. He's not Rhode Island. He's a person. Come on. He's a Baptist. Oh, and I forgot somebody. I'll bring her in just a moment too. And then she comes a moment or two later. But he starts the Baptist idea, which is coming from England. Baptists have a problem with those of us who are Puritans and Catholics. We have infant baptism. It's not you have no choice, Helen. You're gonna get it no matter what. Is it meaningful when you do it that way, Bill? No, because you were raised that way. That's how I knew I could ask you that safely. And they say, no, you have to actually choose it, which means adult, which means at least 12, if not 20, or whatever else. And so the Puritans say, we don't like you. We're going to hang you tomorrow. And the governor of Boston, a guy named John Winthrop, says, hey, Roger, you better run for your life. I know it's January, but you better run, because they're going to hang you tomorrow. So, John Winthrop's not a bad person, he's just a governor. And so Roger flees to a place called Rhode Island, where he founds a place called Providence. And over the next little bit of time, I'm jumping ahead briefly here just to kind of give us the connection right here. A little bit of time later, other Baptists are afraid the Puritans are going to invade Rhode Island and conquer Rhode Island. And they flee Rhode Island, going where, Bill? Holmdel. And Sharon, I should have caught you two on that one. They flee to this part of Nowheresville in about 1665 or thereabouts. And what have they found, Sharon? This church. Oh, yes. Right? This church. But so that's just complicated diversion here. I want to mention Connecticut. Also 1636. Connecticut is founded by Puritans who think the Puritans in Boston are not being strict enough. Who knows what blue laws are? Where do they come from? Connecticut, not Boston. Because the Connecticut Puritans are like, you people are being too relaxed and being too, sorry about the mic camera, hi, being too friendly, and you're not following the rules good enough. I was thinking about this morning, The Puritans in Boston, the Puritans in Connecticut are kind of like the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews here in the world today, where you have the Orthodox are following strict rules, but the ultra-Orthodox are going, no, you've got to follow even more strict rules. So we have, even within the Puritan tradition, this early separation of what's okay and what's not okay. So that's going on. 1638, Delaware is founded. Who's been to Delaware recently? Knows who founded Delaware? Swedes. Lutherans come to Delaware. They found a place called Lewis. That's why it's spelled funny. Lewes. And they found Wilmington. And by the way, I went to Christiana High School in Newark, Delaware, named after Queen Christina of Sweden, because that was first a Swedish colony. The English settled just upstream and took all the Indian trade with them, which drove the Swedes out because the Indians wouldn't come far enough south to trade with the Swedes. They went to the English fort instead, and English were nice people sometimes, but they won, so they had that excuse, I guess. So we move forward. Eventually, we get into North Carolina, South Carolina. The English conquer New Amsterdam, 1664, and they kick out the Dutch, who end up in New Jersey. All the Reformed churches around here are Dutch Reform, and there's a heavy presence in New York and New Jersey of this ancient Dutch traditions. By the way, you may have noticed that we just absorbed about 4 Dutch Reformed churches into the UCC just last year. So, 1681, Pennsylvania gets founded. And who did that and why? Anybody? William Penn. And what did he do it for? Quakers, right? To make because Quakers are weird people. Quakers believe that Jesus is in all of us. Quakers believe that the light of Jesus is in every single one of us, and there's no reason to have leaders. We all have the ability to understand and to interpret that. And I can say that without getting lightning struck on me, because I am descended from a major, prominent Quaker. So I can get away with saying that, at least today. Then we go down, the last colony to be founded is Georgia, and that's founded as a penal colony, as a prison. So in all of this, what we've come up with is how many different religions have come to the US now? We have Catholic, we have 2 kinds of Puritan, we have the Pietists, who are the Pilgrims, we have Church of England, we have Baptists, and we have Quakers. And we have Lutherans. That's 8. 8 kinds, not yet. They show up starting 1740 or so, I think. But we have at least 8 kinds of Christians before we get to 1700. They're not Christians. But yes, and we have some Jews. Jews are driven out, actually, almost completely by the English. They don't like them particularly. Although, yeah, there are some Jews who would say around I don't remember when the synagogue in New York is destroyed or built over or abandoned or something, but the oldest settlement is in Rhode Island. It is a Jewish synagogue that's still around. So yeah, you do have Jews here also. Good. Okay, so what we have here at this time is we have the Catholics. They're not in the English colonies yet, but they are here and there in corners of Maryland, and they're in Florida. They have a pope. They have bishops. They have the 7 sacraments. They have the role of the priests as the intermediary between you and God. They have the saints as intermediaries. That's Catholic. We don't like Catholics, by the way. That's the Pope, that's the enemy. Nobody aside from the Catholics likes the Catholics. And those of you who are ex-Catholic, I'm sorry, but you probably know the history of the Catholics in the US as well as I do. Then we have the Church of England. Church of England has, at this time, the head is the monarch, the king or the queen of England. They still have bishops. They still have the intercessionary power of the bishops and the priests and things. And then you get to the Puritans. The Puritans, oh, by the way, the Puritans absorbed the Pilgrims in 1685 or 90, so the Pilgrims get wiped out. They get absorbed, and we don't hear about them much anymore. They believe in self-government. Each congregation governs itself, elects its leader. The leaders need to be educated. That's why Harvard College was founded. That's why Yale was founded. Princeton was founded for similar reasons, but not quite the same thing. Rutgers was founded as a similar training place for the Dutch Reform ministers and things. So we have a strong educational framework here. But each of us, one of the things that Luther said is there's a priesthood of all believers, that all of us can talk directly, can interact directly. And the problem with that is we can all read the Bible ourselves and make our own decisions about what it means. That's once you get that, everything kind of falls apart because we can argue very, very, very easily. So that's where you get the fragmenting of more and more and more Christianities, because we start to decide and argue about who actually is right about whatever. Then you get to the Baptists, and we are shedding sacraments as we go through this, from 7 down to 2. There are 2 left for Puritans and Baptists. What are they, Reverend?
Eucharist, baptism.
We have the Eucharist, also called communion, and we have baptism. That's the only one. Everything else is no longer, we don't have, we have marriage, but it's no longer holy in the same way. We get rid of a bunch of the other ones. There's no last rites, those kinds of things. Then we get to the Quakers, who don't even have ministers. So my point in all of this is massive, massive diversity within the Christian tradition about what Christianity actually means. Okay? Comments, thoughts, questions? Because I could go on for a while. If I have 15 minutes to go on.
Well, we should go on for 3 hours.
Well, I will, but over the course of the next month, okay? But any thoughts, Joel? Oh, wait, but there's a microphone somewhere.
Here.
There's one over here, too. This is the red one, Matt, if that matters.
Well, one of the things that I find interesting also, learning the geographic landscape, is during this Protestant Reformation, the emphasis or lack thereof on the ornateness of the sanctuaries. And so one of the things that is often symbolic of American Protestantism is anything Catholic was just bad.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get up in through New England and whatnot, some of the churches are incredibly modest. No stained glass, very kind of stark and bleak. And one of the things that I found interesting about this specific sanctuary is this is rather ornate for a Baptist church.
space.
But then somebody last week we were talking about that some of the sanctuary was probably decorated in the 1800s, and so which would have been the Victorian. So there must have been. I suspect that what originally was here in the 16 something or other was probably a little bit more than just wood and paint.
Well, this building was built in 1707 or 5, I forget which. 5.
But I suspect that there was a renovation a couple hundred years after
it was
that.
from that back wall there to this wall right here, and it was flat. And it was a flat ceiling, and we don't know about the windows, but these windows are from at least 1880 or thereabouts, and this elevated floor is the same time period, and beyond that I don't know, but that's the guesses I've heard about. Bill, you were perhaps more working with John Waldron during that research?
I know I'm old, but not that old.
How about you, Sharon? Are you that old?
No.
Okay, so this is an interesting space for a Baptist church. It stopped being Baptist only really in 1968, because this was the Baptist sanctuary even during the semi-merger of the Dutch Reformed Church across the road and this congregation here starting in the mid-1930s. So,
I have a question.
Yeah,
That you can repeat.
I will.
Is it, going off the title of your talk, is it safe to say that most or all of the earliest inhabitants were religious?
So the question I just heard is, how religious were the inhabitants? Was there a universal understanding that we're all Christian, even if we differ on what that means? And the first answer I want to give to that goes back to 1620 and the arrival of the Mayflower. The Mayflower had on it 2 groups of people. You had the Pilgrims, and you had the strangers. Is that what you said, Bill?
I thought it was prisoners.
Oh, no, they come later. And you have the strangers. The strangers are the workmen who are not believing in the pilgrim belief system. Maybe they're worshiping, maybe they're not, but they're there to do the work and teach them how to survive, basically. They're not required to go to church. They're not part of the church community. And as you go around, you do find that the church is the center of the community. And so, yes, people are focused, generally speaking, on that Sunday experience. But at the same time, there are substantial parts of the population who are not bothering to do what they're supposed to, as in go to church. And I say that because I've been reading various things about the Salem witch trials in 1692. And because, by the way, one of my ancestors was hanged as a witch in 1692. Fortunately, she had children at the time, otherwise I wouldn't be here. But the stories that I've read about, the history that I've read, talk about who's going to church and who's not going to church. And the people who are not going is not insignificant. There are people who are coming once a month or once a year or not at all. Now, they're mostly ostracized, so there is a heavy pressure to be part of the church community. But it is not everybody doing it, everybody accepted in it. However, as I said, the church is the center of community. So if you're not going to do that, you're not part of the community. Does that answer the question well enough? We don't know, of course, down to the individual villages and decades how active. That said, as you move forward, a lot of, especially New England, they are paying taxes to the state, which are supporting the church. So there is a strong interlocking between church and state. But let's turn to, I've talked about how these Christianities differ in their belief systems, and kind of the most fundamental difference is on baptism and on how you communicate with God. And they're killing each other over these decisions. In Virginia, if you're Baptist, you get your tongue cut out. You don't want to do that, do you? So you kind of go, and you go off secretly, and you worship secretly. Joyce?
Where do the Huguenots fall in this?
The question was, where are the Huguenots? And I want to add into them more Anabaptists, because you mentioned them also, Betty. Huguenots are kicked out of France in, I'm going to say 1615. Am I right on that date? Thank you, Sylvia. And many of them start to come to the New World. Huguenots are Calvinists. Huguenots are basically Puritans, but they're French Puritans. And many of them actually go to Canada, not the American colonies. They end up in Quebec and the coastal pieces that England conquers at some point. They're in not Newfoundland, but what's the islands down there? Prince Edward Island, the one, Nova Scotia. And they end up other places like that. So they don't come in large numbers to affect what is the U.S. and becoming the U.S., but they're there. That said, we do have Germans coming in. Anabaptists are coming in. They're landing in the mid-1700s in Pennsylvania, in New York. They're pushing out into Ohio, and they are the Mennonites. We call them that frequently, and we have some of them in the church now. And if you ask Howard Cragel how he was raised, he goes back to what Joel said, the very, 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 very simple worship space, where the entire focus is on the worship, not on looking around and saying, cool, what a nice building. Betty.
Anabaptists, when we were...
Can you have the microphone? Can we have this being broadcast?
I just remember when we were in Holland and Belgium, we were on a tour, and the tour leader said, I'm going to take you in Belgium to the church, and there is a sign of the Anabaptists, and they were persecuted. Mm-hmm. They came to Belgium, and then they came to to the colonies. So.
Yeah, Anabaptists are hated by almost everybody. Yeah. Almost everybody, and and I forget what Anabaptist means versus other kinds of Baptists. Joel, do you have a sense on that?
It has something to do with rebaptism.
Okay.
And I also know that they were, I'm not, no, I don't know what ANA stands for, but I also know that the Anabaptists, a big part of their tradition is kind of radical anti-war positions.
Yeah, okay, that's a good reason to hate them because they're not
and
joining your army.
So they've always been viewed as, no matter where they were, they were viewed as non-patriotic.
Yeah, excellent. Great reason to go and kill them and drive them out and stuff because they're not fighting from my side of understanding. Yeah, so they do end up, and of course today we do have Anabaptists in Pennsylvania in the Amish. That's where they come from. The Mennonites in Ohio and Pennsylvania are from those traditions. So we had what do these Christians agree on? I want to give you two things that you're not going to like. Okay, Jesus. That's all.
Jesus.
Three things. Jesus. Oh, and the Trinity.
And the Trinity.
And the Trinity. Okay, which changes in 1810, but that's after I'm done today. And worship on the Sabbath, which is on Sunday now. But the two things I'm going to focus on are slavery and witchcraft. I'll hit witchcraft first because I've already mentioned witchcraft. Northern Europe especially, Sweden especially, had 200 years of terror about witchcraft. And in the 1650s or so, a couple books got written in Sweden about witches. And yeah, cool. And here you are, you're a young person in the depths of the wilderness in New England or somewhere else, and nothing to do but read. And they're reading these books about witches and what they can do. And this is what turns into not just the Salem witch trials, but there were quite a number of witch trials here in the New World. The most famous being the ones that killed 24 people in Salem, which was actually more of a property dispute than actual worrying about witches, but I won't go into that. But throughout the New World, there's this concern that women especially, men too, but mostly women, are getting out of their place. And they're doing so using witchcraft. And you have and I forgot to mention somebody else also, Anne Hutchinson. I'll put her in right now in a moment. So witchcraft and the reality of witches is universally shared, pretty universally shared. Anne Hutchinson, by the way, 1640-45 time period. She's an obnoxious person. She's a woman. But I repeat myself. No, I'm just kidding. I got killed later. She's in Boston, and she has a brain. She knows how to read. And after the Sunday service, she would host Bible study in her house. Hundreds of people would come to hear what she had to say about Scripture. And you, Karen, you're nodding. What are you thinking? In 1640? They don't like it. They don't like it because guys are the ones. So the other thing that's still universal is that guys are the ones who have the link. Women don't. So she is driven out of Boston. She flees first to Rhode Island, then she ends up in New Amsterdam. And she builds a sawmill just north of New Amsterdam in a place now called the Bronx. And she is sitting there with her family one day when Indians from Delaware are ticked off at the English settlers, and they travel north and they kill her and her entire family. Now, how many of you have driven north of New York City on the Sawmill Parkway? Named after her sawmill? How many of you have been on the Hudson River Parkway? That's her river. And the thing that I want to say is that when this happened, the person said, ha ha, serves her right. We're not talking about sympathy for people. We're talking about purity into my faith. So when they catch it, they deserved it. And she's just one example of that. But witchcraft, that's an aside from that. Witchcraft is,
Her original,
she kind of becomes Baptist. Kind of. I'm not sure she has a label before she's gone, but
you said she originally in Massachusetts.
oh, she's a Puritan. She starts off Puritan. She joins the Puritan community, but you know, if any of you read Scripture, and you join somebody else who's also reading Scripture, how soon will you start to argue about what it said? 7 minutes. Wow, you timed it, 7 minutes. How soon will you say, no, 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 no? And, and she's a very persuasive speaker. People are flocking to her and not going to hear the guys who are Harvard trained. So it's not called Harvard quite yet, but that's about to happen. The real ministers who are trained to tell you, they're going to her who has no education except being able to read. Karen's still saying, cool, I can tell. So we have the other thing they have in common in this Christianity, slavery. I was asked specifically by a friend of mine who's a minister in D.C. to make sure I bring slavery into this, because it's easy to forget slavery. It is for us. We are in the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans into the New World, Jamestown, 1619. And how many of the colonies had legal chattel slavery at the time of our revolution? All but one. And I don't know why New Hampshire didn't, but everybody else did.
Live free or die.
Yeah, I know. Live free or die for the audience. But by the way, back to Salem, the first accusation of Salem witchcraft came from a slave named Tituba, who was brought in from the West Indies, and she had her own witchcraft traditions from West Africa and stuff that she kind of mingled into what was going on here. So she was the first accused person. No one remembers her hardly except for Sylvia, right? And those who read various books, and those who've been to Salem for the museum up there with that kind of stuff. But New Hampshire does not have slavery. New Jersey, it's embedded in New Jersey. It's embedded in Massachusetts. It's embedded in Connecticut. It's embedded across the South. It's there. So this entire country is founded on this mix of Christian principles, some of which I think are pretty repugnant, or else just plain silly. And I'll put witchcraft in the silly category. Okay? And it is 12:15, so let's have 5 minutes of chit-chat if we want, and then we'll call it quits. Karen? Is this a long question, or should I repeat it for you? There you go. Here's a microphone.
How did they incorporate slavery into their belief system? Like, I don't understand how that was done.
Any translation of the Bible, certainly the ones they had then, talk about you and your slaves.
They weren't a full human being. They were just
Well, no, but I don't want to label slaves, but I want to say that they are described in both the Hebrew Scripture, Old Testament, and the Christian Scripture, the New Testament. Slave or free says, what am I quoting?
Yeah.
I can't remember which.
Galatians, Ephesians,
All of those things. You and your slaves, you're no longer man and women, you're no longer slave or free, you are one in Jesus. They're acknowledging the reality of slavery, Karen. It's there. And if you're going to create the new Jerusalem, which is what the Puritans were doing, you've got slavery. Now, I could add into that, although I don't think I need to, the racial component. The racial component happens over time. It's not there in the beginning. Because they first tried to enslave the Native Americans. They didn't work. They can run away too easily because they know where they live. So you bring in people they brought in indentured servants, poor people from England and Ireland, and they were slaves, but for a contract slaves. Slowly over time, you get into hereditary chattel slavery, and you find a wonderful source of people who can be made to work really hard coming from West and Southwest Africa. Any other questions or comments? No? So who wants to hear more? What haven't I talked about yet?
Well, we haven't even gotten to the founding
Right,
part,
exactly. So I have a whole nother series, a whole nother day on who the founders were, what they believed. I know Paul showed me a book right before the service, or afterwards, I forget which was a book that talked something about the belief system of the founding fathers. I didn't look at it closely, but there are various books out there, various stories out there, which try to talk about who they were, what their logic was. I won't do that today unless you want to stay here for another 2 hours. Not exactly, nope. Some of you would do, huh?
Are you going to specifically deal with the founding fathers?
Sure. What I'm going to do next time we meet, if we want to meet again, is talk about the two things. Talk about the education that helped the Founding Fathers think about independence and talk about their belief systems as best we understand what those systems were. It's not always obvious sometimes. But I'll talk about first thing, one thing else, not now, but so there's a period called the Great Awakening from 1740 to 1790 or thereabouts, which is kind of the impetus for the American Revolution. So I'll start with that next time we gather. Look at the actual, the European origins of the idea of independence, talking about Montesquieu, talking about Hobbes, talking about Blackstone, talking about other people like that, and then talk about the actual Founding Fathers, Adams and Jefferson and Henry and all those people. You're scowling at me, sir.
I'm just curious how you're going to find the Founding Father.
we'll wait until next time.
Stay tuned, stay tuned. Anything else? All
Why
right,
don't we thank Dr. Fields for his...
So as I said, next week we're not meeting. Got that camera? Camera, you're folks at the window or something, aren't you? Oh, okay. You can still see me. Hi, camera. We're not meeting next week. The week after we're not meeting. So the first we can meet would be
27th.
the 27th.
Which is New Member Sunday, which is fine.
Just fine.
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll celebrate. We'll have a cake and then come back in here.
We'll have cake and have a cake fight in here as we fight over the Founding Fathers and how we define them.
11:30.
Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.